I think we are ready, right? Okay, shall we begin? Good afternoon and welcome all of you to our last panel, Forms of Solidarity for and Beyond. Before starting actually this session, I would like to thank to our colleagues, Raluca Țurcănașu and Adina Marincea, who are actually in charge of communication and PR. And also I would like to thank to Cristian Grecu, who helped us a lot with the visual part, posters and brochures. As Tasia mentioned previously, Anastasia mentioned previously, also Emil is helping us with the technical part. So thank you a lot, Emil. And I also, I would like to say hi to Agota Abran, who is watching us, and because she has had a baby, her daughter Petra, she couldn't be here with us, but she's watching us, and we will talk to her later on. I need to remind you that you can comment on online on YouTube page, and also Anastasia, Birgit, and Ioana, you have like 20 minutes, as I said to you before, and then we will have some time for the questions. And having in mind these logistic aspects, I would like also to continue with the presentation of the panel, which actually it's like a part of it's following the same cultural aspects, but with a focus right now on eco-villages, food justice, and initiatives for livable place context, different forms of solidarity and alternatives to these normal lives. Because with this kind of context of pandemic situation, I think we are more and more vulnerable, and we need to have like to debate more on social justice, food, shelter, and also medical care. So we will start today with the presentation of Anastasia Oprea, and she will talk about everyday practices in European eco-villages, remaking citizenship, and the potential for systemic transformation. When you are ready, Tasia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Adina, and I want to thank you all for being here. It's an unusual situation for me, as I'm usually behind the scenes in the events that we organize at the Center for the Study of Modernity and the Rural World. So yeah, it's a novel posture for me here. And without further ado, I will start sharing my screen. It's the first time I'm making a presentation, and also I'm very rusty as I haven't really done much research in the last year, so bear with me, please. I will be talking today about practices in eco-villages. This is my PhD research. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra. I take the stance of doing embodied positional research. I am an intersectional feminist, and I do take the decolonial approach both in my theory and practice. That said, I do contend and accept the imperfections of putting all this into theory and practice, which doesn't, and I think it shouldn't stop us from trying. So I will talk today from the perspective of theory and practice. And first of all, I want to say that I think it's an emancipatory stance to see them in an equal relation. as in a dialogical relational connection, so not considering theory to be in a vertical relation with practice, but rather understanding that theory informs practice and vice versa. And so the theoretical concepts I'm working mostly in my PhD research are citizenship and social justice. I work from within the international relations field, but my theoretical research is informed also by the concept of plural performativity and that of citizenship enactments from the field of political philosophy and political theory. And let's say, traditional definition of citizenship would be that it is the legal rights and fundamental duties that bound people from a particular political community, namely a state. I would like to add to this a layer which sees citizenship as a dynamic and relational set of heterogeneous practices contingent of the everyday, namely that the practices of citizens depend very much on where they are located, the opportunities the state and the institutional setting allows them, and so on. Also, I think citizenship has a normative dimension. This is a perspective put forward by Linklater, for example, and the norms that it should entail are peace, justice, inclusion, and equity. Citizenship can also be understood as performative, where co-option is seen as a relational process. And the potential for emancipation through citizenship is completed by seeing it, according to Linklater, as a possible vehicle linking local governance with the possibility of a universal citizenship, again, based on the norms previously mentioned. And regarding the heterogeneous practices and going a bit into the political and citizenship practices in ecovillages, we have here a picture of the local council in Artieda, which is the village hosting Artera Bizimodu eco-village. The people you see in the forefront of this picture, namely Sylvia to the left and Adrian to the right, are members of the eco-village and have also been elected in the local council last year in May. So this, I think, shows a very pragmatic, if you want, approach to what politics is, or the political could be, in that they are able to also enact alternative micropolitical practices within the eco-village and interact and integrate the mainstream political environment, thus having the opportunity to directly influence policy, even if at this local village council level. In terms of practices, I am taking this, let's say, chunk of my research, and we'll talk to you about the everyday self-governing practices in eco-villages, as I think they're most relevant for the topic we're discussing. And these are the micropolitical practices, for example, of decision-making, and also the socio-cultural practices which govern the interpersonal relations amongst the people in the eco-village. They are the ones that, or are the practices which relate the eco-village with the local cultural context that they are inserted in, and the larger national one, for example, or the European one from a cultural perspective. And I made a note here because I didn't want to forget this very important note that the intentional praxis of social justice recreate its subjects through its collective enactment, meaning that enacting these practices of social justice transforms not just the political community that they are enacted in, but also the subject. So the persons doing citizenship different, they also become a different type of citizen. And in the case of eco-villages, we're talking here about sustainability, but also sustainability from a bigger view, in the sense of holistic sustainability, and I'm going to go into this. So a very quick and easy definition of an eco-village is an intentional community made up of 5 to 8 people from different families that come together willingly with the intention of creating a more sustainable community and way of life. And eco-villages in Europe have been organizing themselves in different networks, which means, let's say, a sort of institutionalizing of their networks. The definition that the Global Eco-Village Network Europe gives for eco-villages is of intentional, traditional, or urban communities that are conscientiously designed through locally owned participatory processes in all four areas of regeneration or sustainability, which are social, cultural, ecological, and economy, in order to regenerate their social and natural environments. So regeneration here is actually a change in language. It used to be sustainability until not so long ago. And I want to show you a bit how these eco-villages in Europe are located, how many they are actually. We are supposed to see here a map, a map of eco-villages. My research, my field research is mostly ethnographic. I did event ethnography at the Lilleore Eco-Village in Estonia 2 years ago, also event ethnography at the Global Eco-Village Network meeting last year. In Comune di Bagnaia, I visited Eco-Village Moldova last year for a different project, and my main participatory observation was done in Artera Bizimodu in Euskal Herria, that is Basque Country, northern Spain, province of Navarra. I'll very shortly present the way they word and they express their vision and mission. They work collaboratively, so it's rather cooperation that they're after, not competition. They are very much oriented towards care as grounds for sustainability. Care here doesn't necessarily just mean the environmental care, so green energies and so forth, but also the way we enact care within our communities. So in terms of interpersonal relations, how we care from one community to the other, but also how we care for the self. Their vision is very much about sharing and participating in the global transformation. And they also have this grounding vision that they take the responsibility to participate in this transition movement in culture towards more sustainability. And the way they do it, so their mission is to cohabit, to live together. It's about 50 people who live in the palace that we've seen in the first picture, and we're going to see some more with different kind of profiles. They are very much also oriented towards training. They are wanting to establish a university of transition in order to disseminate their knowledge and practices. On the economical side, and production as well, they develop local production spaces, which are driven by the permaculture principles. And also, probably most relevant for the talk I want to have today is that they develop an internal organizational structure which allows them to self-govern themselves according to sociocratic principles. And speaking of sociocratic principles, I hope you're now seeing the image with the tree on the right-hand side, where their internal organization is shown according to the sociocratical principles. We have there the roots of the tree, which is the vision. We then have a coordination circle, which harmonizes everything, all decisions and practices that occur within the Artera Bizimodu Eco-Village. We then have a decision-making circle regarding the building they live in with more operational circles. We have a circle for common life, if you want, and another one for economy and production. The double arrows there show another principle of sociocracy, namely the double linkages between the groups. Another important principle of sociocracy is consent. So they do not work as eco-villages usually worked, or other intellectual communities worked on the assembly model of consensus. They work on consent, and it's a relevant difference there. And another very important thing is that they practice elections without candidates, meaning that the circle itself chooses the person that they see more fit for a certain role or position, and that means that they are invested with this trust from their circle. And now, if time allows, I want to give you a few examples of their practices. For example, they used to have, in the first year of existence, a private school run by them, and this used to be the PE class. And of course, the school was organized according to the same principles of sustainability. They host the Global Ecovillage Network office within their quarters, and this is the map from the meeting last year in La Comune di Bagnaia. They also have this local agricultural production project, which is driven by permaculture principles, and which then also provides some of the economic revenue for the community. They are integrated within the Basque cultural movement and participated, for example, in the Basque language Euskera Run, which happens every 2 years, and this is the kilometers they had to run and the time. Another very important social practice, I think, is the one of eating together. And for that, they have a huge kitchen where they can, when they take shifts in cooking. And they do celebrate a lot. So they bring a lot, they come together a lot to eat every day, but also to celebrate. This is actually from my birthday party last year. And they do celebrate the establishment of the community every year. They are now 6 years old, which means that they have passed the critical first 5 years in which most intentional communities actually are dissolved for reasons related precisely with the social aspects of being together. So this is what you see here is the Palace of the Pyrenees, as it used to be called. It used to be a Catholic seminary for boys. They rent it out. They have their living quarters here. They have here the Geneco village office. Here in the left-hand side, you have the kitchen and the eating area. And then you have meeting rooms. And for example, this is a picture from one of the most impressive and emotional actions I witnessed, which is an incubatory for ecovillages in Spain, organized by the Iberian network of ecovillages. And it's basically a laboratory for creating new ecovillages that is sharing and accompanying communities in trying to become new political communities. And where I would like our discussion to start from, to pick up from, is this my first intent of applying my theoretical frame to my findings in the field. And what I'm talking here is a few points that I've come up with where the theory and the norms informing the eco-village practices, and particularly Artera Bisimondo practices, do have actually, in reality, dual outcomes. And one of the things I want to mention is that although they contest the nation state by self-organizing and self-governing within this contained territory of Artera Bisimondo, of this Palace of the Pyrenees, they also use as a prop, let's say, or an argument, a type of cultural Basque nationalism, which is actually, from their point of view, it's an emancipatory endeavor in that it comes to contest the hegemony of the Spanish state, a state that can be seen from the Basque perspective as a colonialist state. So Basque country, as Manuela said it in the left panel, could be seen as an uneasy post-colonial space. And so this cultural nationalism basically means reviving the language, which was banned during the dictatorship, and participating in all this celebration, learning the dances, the music, and so on. They do have a somewhat depoliticized normative discourse, in the sense that they do use sustainability as main normative stance, with what it derives from it, especially in environmental and social terms. But what I mean by this depoliticization is that they do not explicitly state that they are, for example, anti-capitalist or anti-heteronormative or anti-nationalist. And what I've come to find out at the last year meeting of the Global Eco-Village Network is that this posits a danger of the eco-village practices simply based on sustainability being co-opted by eco-fascists or green nationalists. Because they center their discourse mostly on sustainability, and so it's quite wide and sort of appropriate to the current, let's say, environmental crisis, they managed to have an impact on policy. As we've seen, there are two people, members of the eco-village, that were elected in the local council, so they participate directly in devising local policy, but also through their networks such as Global Eco-Village Network, they managed to have an advocacy impact on policymaking within the European Union, for example, in establishing the European Day of Sustainable Communities. The danger here is of assimilating these, at least this discourse, if not the practices, within the current normative framework that is using the discourse of sustainability and the practices of eco-villages in Europe being, for example, associated with such concepts, in my opinion, unviable concepts of, for example, green capitalism. And yet another issue which probably goes in a way the most against the norm of inclusion is that although the members of eco-villages have this privilege of becoming self-emancipated subjects through their practices and their living within this new and alternative political communities, the access to eco-villages themselves is still very much gated mostly by material conditions. That is, eco-village living is mostly available at this time in Europe and the US, for example, to white middle-class people. And this, of course, poses a question of how should inclusion be done in a way that goes beyond this already privileged class. But it's something that, for example, Global Eco-Village Network is aware of, and it's an ongoing discussion theme even for them. So these are the points that I wanted to make. As you can see, this is not the Artera Bisimondo is not what you would probably typically expect of an eco-village, in the sense that they are not individual houses. It's one huge building. They even have a pool, which actually they're not allowed to use because they're not, the local authorities didn't give them the permits. But yeah, I hope I gave you a window into how eco-villages work and what's the potential for systemic transformation there through their practices and norms. And we'll take it from here in our discussion later on. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Tasia, for this, Anastasia, for this presentation. We will discuss more on at the end of our session. We will continue right now with Birgit Hoinle from International Center for Ethics in the Sciences and Humanities, University of Tübingen. And she will talk about food justice, and her title is Searching for Food Justice, the Coloniality of Food Geopolitics and Initiatives for the Commoning of Food Networks and Seed Knowledge. So we will continue with you when you are ready.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I'm also happy to participate in the Telciu Summer Conference after 2 years again, offered this time virtually. And yeah, since last time I have finished now my PhD in geography, so I will give you a little inside view of part of my field work. around alternative food networks in Colombia, and on case I'm actually engaged in Germany, which is the local food policy councils, this network. And my focus is on the coloniality of food geographies and movements to for the commoning of food in seeds. And so to start, first, I will present an analysis about the coloniality of food geography, and the second step present the two case studies from the south and the north. So what do I mean with coloniality of food geographies? I make a reference to the concept of coloniality of power by Quijano, who said, he's from the group Modernity and Coloniality, who said that the expansion of colonialism went hand in hand with capitalism and led to the international division of labor based on racial and ethnic hierarchies. And until nowadays, these global colonial power relations shape and structure global economy, and also in the case of food economy. But also food itself has its colonial connotation. So it's always around the question of how food is used and valued in different contexts. For instance, what was analyzed by the group of environmental history was that, for example, in Spanish colonialism, potatoes were introduced and widespread in Europe, whereas amaranth, as a nutritional and ceremonial corn, was prohibited in the Spanish colonies. And it's also about the coloniality of knowledge, because the local knowledge about food and its properties, and especially medical plants, was appropriated by the central powers, and was also invisibilized, that the people had this kind of knowledge. And these dynamics continue until nowadays, and make lead to unequal global food geographies. And why is this an ongoing context process? I argue that's because of dynamics of the enclosure of the commons. I understand commons as shared spaces and resources that are for the reproduction and production of life, that are managed in self-governance by communities. And the enclosure of the commons is an historic process of dispossession of peasants of their land to make them disponible for the, in that time, industrialization process. An analysis that Polanyi made, and Federici highlights that this went hand in hand with also changes in gender relations, as women were then limited to private spheres and reproductive work. So these colonial power relations reproduce until nowadays unequal global food geographies by the accumulation of dispossession and processes of enclosure that we can see, for example, with the dispossession of commonly used territories or seeds, or the agricultural knowledge. But to exemplify this a little bit, what do I mean with unequal food geographies? One example is the world consumption footprint. We see here that's very unequal distributed between former colonies and Europe and North America, but there are also changes and in Asia, like increasing tendencies of consumption, also in a very unequal level within these countries, and that is measured with the amount of hectare one person needs for their consumption, how many hectares we are used to. This is visualized in this map. And another very emblematic example for the unequal food geographies and coloniality of power is the case of cacao, food which was also appropriated in this time in the Mexican colonies from the Aztec indigenous people, then brought to Western Africa and installed in big, huge monocultural production. And until nowadays, there are problems of child labor and ecological devastation. But until now, there's the same structures that the producer countries only export the raw material, the cacao. The people there in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire never eat chocolate and only earn like 6% of the final price, whereas the plus value generation and processing is in the Central Europe countries where companies and supermarkets earn 80% of the end price. So there's no participation in the value chain. We see here also that the local and global scales of the food geographies are very connected. The unequal food geographies, we see them on global scale, as I said, which was also conceptualized by Brandon Wilson with the term of imperial mode of living, making reference to the appropriation of natural resources and labor force from the global south or east to the north. And very recently, there was also within Germany example that came up now with Corona, but was persisting also since years ago, the exploitative working condition for Eastern European seasonal workers. For example, the case of Tönnies, a huge meat fabric, and behind we see in the picture the housing condition which led to the spreading of the virus, and these conditions came up only now up with the coronavirus and also stand for the inequality in the food geographies. And this lead to phenomena of food injustice on local scale. And food justice as a concept that was raised by environmental justice movement to make reference that foodscapes are shaped by unequal power relations related to categories of race, class, and gender that create exclusion from the access to healthy food. For example, in the US American cities where this movement came up, there's the phenomenon of food desert, which means that that affects especially Black communities or lower class communities who doesn't have the access to really healthy food or have to buy mostly fast food. So this movement of food justice raises the call for the democratic participation in the production of urban foodscapes. So taking this analysis in mind, I want to the two case studies I want to present briefly. One is a little part of my field research in Colombia from a seed network, and the other a case from the north of a movement an initiative I'm engaged in of local food policy councils, and to ask which commoning strategies do they use to confront inequalities in the food system. So the first example of Colombia, it's network Guardianes de Semillas, Guardian of Seeds, that also in this case, we see the coloniality of power structures in the agricultural and food system. Like seeds are like the point of departure for agriculture. That's why I have chosen this example. And in Colombia, with the free trade agreements in 2012 and 2013 with the EU and USA, there were only certified seeds were now allowed, which fulfilled the requirements of the UPO and 91. And so the traditional practices of seed exchange and practices was criminalized, and also the introduction of modern biotechnologies and sterile seed types by big companies like Bayer Monsanto led the peasants to be depending on these kind of modified seeds, and so they lost. Many of them have lost their own means of reproduction, the seeds. And so, as an answer to this, the networks like the Guardianes de Semillas, or also another network like Free Seed Network of Colombia, became active on the one hand politically to influence national policy towards seed sovereignty and highlight issues like which this quotation says in Colombia until 67 we had around 3,000 varieties of potatoes. Today we have only like 65. With the maize, it's the same. It's resistant. These seeds don't gonna disappear. So they highlight the agro-biodiversity in seeds that there was before. And one strategy of commoning is, on the one hand, to appropriate communal physical spaces, like we see on the right hand, communal houses for the preservation of native seeds, where they do store native seeds and continue with the exchange. And already 8 zones in Colombia, more indigenous territories, were declared transgenetic free. And also that commoning strategies have an epistemic dimension to confront the coloniality of knowledge. So seeds are very related to regional identities and regional or local knowledge about their reproduction, about their modes of preparation, like the maize we see above. It's from a certain region in the Caribbean zone of Colombia, and that goes together with a certain education, like the quotation says. My parents were peasant. I was growing up with this kind of education to always preserve some seeds. And in these spaces, like the communal houses for seeds or the urban gardens, this kind of knowledge, which mostly it's invisibilized or neglected, gets more visibility and recognition. And with the seeds, people also share the knowledge about it, about their forms of reproduction, about their use. So they contribute to maintain the seeds as a commons, as a shared culturally common good. And now the second case about the local food policy consensus. Now going from the seed to the food, to eating. These are platforms that try to create networks between producers, retailers, gastronomy consumers, civil society organization, and also public institutions. The aim is on a more local scale to re-democratize food policies and to strengthen the rural-urban linkages. The first food policy councils were founded in the USA and then in Canada as a response to the phenomena of food injustice and to confront the exclusion of socially disadvantaged groups to fresh, healthy food. So it's also issue about health. And Brazil is also was very during one time. I think nowadays it's different, but since 2003 was very successful. The food policy councils were also operating on a national scale, and they reached that 30% of food supply at public schools came from regional peasant agriculture. And in Germany, that's the case I'm now engaged in. There's already a network, but it's a more newer movement since 2016 of around 40 local food policy councils. They're mostly engaged in strategies to make food supply in schools more sustainable, create producer-consumer networks, and are active in awareness raising and education. And we in Tübingen, it's a small town, 90,000 people in the southwest of Germany. We are since March in the process of building up such an initiative. We are now a little group of people from alternative food networks, local NGOs, and university. And this process of building up this food policy concepts was accompanied by a course with students of the University of Tübingen in Rothenburg, and they made like surveys with local stakeholders to ask what would be relevant for them to have such a food policy concept. And so the motivation also for the group engaged was to transform the prevailing agro-industrial food system from a local point, and to make especially the regional agrobiodiversity more visible, as we see in the picture on the right. Like in that region, it's very characteristic. There are meadows with fruit trees as kind also of local cultural heritage about it. And now, what is the common strategies about these local food policy councils? Well, the idea is to open up the deliberate spaces to broader stakeholder participation in local decision about food policies, and to raise awareness about food as a community good and not as commodity. So to try to take it out of market circles. And for example, the Food Policy Council in Innsbruck promoted this by public actions about edible cities and public space, other kind of space appropriation. But the challenge I see is that also in this case, again, a little bit like in the eco-villages, most of the activists come from a white middle class academic background. So the idea or the challenge is really to open the organization format, to make it open for local producers who don't have mostly the same time and access to participate in this kind of organization formats, and also to integrate people from diverse social backgrounds. So working, for example, with migrant organization to really let participate people we want to address. Yes, I see also for a challenge in our initiative in Tübingen. So to come to the end, to the conclusions and perspectives, better to say, to open questions, they are still going on, and to discuss. Well, the main question for me would be now how to decolonize unequal food geographies. I think the two cases I presented that gave some ideas about it, where they both stand for the intentions to try to redemocratize the shaping of rural urban foodscapes and to decommercialize the access to seeds and food by organizing them in form of commons. And very important in both cases is the political engagement at local and national scales to resist the exclusionary tendencies of a neoliberal organized food system on regional and global levels. And the strategies of commoning have in common that they have both material and symbolic epistemic dimension. On the one hand, the appropriation of really physical material spaces like the edible city spots or the communal seed houses, but it's also about the recognition of invisibilized knowledge and local agrobiodiversity, so to confront the tendency of coloniality of knowledge. But the challenges are great and are a lot, are huge. On the one hand, to make the organization formats open for integrating invisibilized social group, and as I presented, more local initiatives to try to make an upscaling, for example, by integrating them in global networks or make the initiatives more globally connected. And also, you, for example, the case of cacao, major challenge is also to for structural changes towards just participation in the value chains on regional level, also on global scale. And what we can do, or what are the perspectives, are to use global crises like right now to raise awareness about the injustices tendency in the current food system, and also to make visible the agency of regional food networks in different places and to connect them. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy and looking forward to your question and discussion.
You need to unmute yourself, Adina. We can't hear you right now.
Oh, sorry. I'm saying all the time this and I forget about it. So thank you very much, Birgit, for this interesting presentation, and congratulations for your PhD. It's true that it's important to understand how the food is produced and where the power is it, and also which are the solutions to produce more healthy food for everyone in a solidary way. So also to have a sustainable food coming from regional parts of villages, and it will continue our session. And now we are going to in a perspective more locally, and we will continue our discussion with Hestia-Ioana Delibas from Cluj-Napoca. And her presentation is titled "The Peasant Box: Forms of Solidarity Between Consumers and Local Producers." You have the word.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Hestia, as you said. I'm very excited to be to my first Telciu conference. Unfortunately, not at Telciu, but nonetheless, I'm very excited to present a part of my research. I will first share my screen, just a second. So, as I said, this is I don't know if you can see it. Okay. This is a part of my research on alternative food networks in Romania, focusing on one case study that is Cutia Țăranului, a peasant box, one such short distribution schemes from Cluj-Napoca. So first of all, my research started from one question: how can we imagine new relationship into our food system? And I think this question is especially relevant now, considering the injustices and inconsistencies of the global neoliberal food regime. And I think Birgit did an eloquent job in describing and showcasing all these injustices that exist. Wonderful presentation also. So we have this inconsistency of the global food system that can vary from the problem of deregulation of markets, the delocalization of food production, their ruralization, which have a high impact on the marginalized rural communities, but also important to remark that intensive agriculture has also a big impact on the biodiversity and increase of climate change. So we can see how these concerns have created ways of addressing in the terms of alternative food networks. So alternative food networks is more of an umbrella term for a variety of practices that could be, for example, community gardens, community-supported agricultures, agriculture cooperatives, or farmers market. As we can see, there is a diversity of practices, but what these alternative food networks have in common are I think, two aspects. First of all, they try to relocalize the production and distribution of food. And also they try to reintroduce close relationships into the food system that are based on solidarity or trust. So alternative food networks are more visible these days, and they do a great job in bringing in the public eye important discussion in regard to the inherent problems of the food system. And they also propose a vision on how to restructure the system and the relation within it. Of course, there are also concerns that alternative food networks are not able to escape the neoliberal logic that they try to criticize without reinforcing it. While I think these critics are worth to be taken into account, it's also worth mentioning that they are built on a capital-centric ideas, which, as Gibson Graham says, considers the economy to be in just one way, where in fact there are a diversity of economies, and it's important to be able and to try to engage in a diverse economy framework. So I'm going to discuss briefly about my methodology. So I did my fieldwork from December 2019 to June 2020. And I use qualitative research methodology and as a strategy, the case study, as I said. My data was obtained to semi-structured interviews with producers, consumers, and the initiator of this project. I also did secondary data analysis on the project website. So I will discuss now a little bit about my fieldwork, Peasant Box, or Cutia Țăranului, how it's known in Romanian. It started from 2012, and it started in Cluj-Napoca, but now it is present in approximately 10 counties and has approximately 25 producers and a few hundred consumers. It is a community-supported agriculture project that is built on based on a subscription to consumers to a farm near the city that prepares and delivers boxes weekly of seasonal food. So in this or how this network functions is based on a few rules. For the consumers, there are the requirement of having a long-term subscription, so you cannot subscribe for only one time. And this rule is meant to, especially it's created with the idea of building this close relationship between consumers and producers. Also, consumers have to buy every week, so they cannot skip 1 week, especially so this rule is especially made to secure a constant stream of income for the farmers. Also, there are no negotiation on price or content, so the producer decides on what comes in the box and on the price and the date of delivery. There are also some requirements on the part of producers. They have to have a good relationship with the earth. So that showcase that Peasant Box has the concern of agroecology in mind. Also, producers have some logistical requirements, like having a car, being close to a city, being able to have communication means with the consumers. Now I want to remark that these requirements can have an exclusionary effect on certain categories of rural producers, and it's important to keep this in mind when proposing this kind of networks as a fix for the inconsistencies of the the rural space. So they cannot stay in what I want to say. They cannot stay instead of actual policies for the rural problems. All right, so now I'm going to discuss a bit about my findings, and I'm going to discuss about the governing principles of this particular CSA. The initiators have created the framework on which this network is functioning, and these principles underlie the further political premises of the project. So the first governing principle is that Peasant Box is meant to be a space that offers more autonomy to the small producers. So the Peasant Box was created not for producers, but with them, and they have total control over the network, the prices, the way they are doing delivery. So in this way, they have more autonomy than, for example, the case of small producer in the conventional distribution networks. That's one aspect. Another is the principle of having these direct and informal relations, and this is a central aspect of this network. And throughout the interview, this seemed to be the main reason that kept many in the network for such a long time. I want to remark that although alternative food networks are kind of a novelty in the East European space, the idea of informal relations between or informal exchanges between rural farmers and urban dwellers is not new. So it still exists, but I think the main difference between other informal relations formed and this kind of alternative movements is the underlying political premises and the advocacy work that they are doing in bringing awareness to these injustices that are embedded into the food system. Moving on, another principle is regarding sustainable agriculture. As I said, they do promote a more sustainable agriculture, but I want to stress that there is no one single definition that is imposed, and in no way producers are monitored on this. And initiators leave a lot of space for producers to create their own understanding on what a sustainable agriculture can look like. That is why we have producers that have different approaches to sustainable agriculture, while some focus on permaculture practices, others would focus more on traditional forms of agriculture. So there is what I want to say is a diversity of agricultural practices. Another governing principle that is very important in the network is the idea of creating a horizontal hierarchical structure. As I mentioned, the initiator have created the framework, but in no way are monitoring or controlling the producers. So they have full responsibility, but also full liberty into managing their networks. And yeah, I think this is an important aspect for the network. Also because it creates a space where they could have more agency in this regard. Lastly, I said here the logic of care. as opposed, I would say, as opposed to only driven or only market-driven logic. And we can very easily see how the rules that I presented before could not be understood unless we are talking about a solidarity economy, because the consumers have very little choice, and they agree to be part of this kind of network only thinking that only based on the logic of care. Okay, so we discussed a bit about the governing principles that underlie this alternative food network that we are discussing. Now I want to further look at what are a few of the consequences that these specific governing principles have. So first of all, I want to discuss about the danger of self-exploitation. Of course, when you're introducing direct relations of between producer and consumer that are based on trust and reciprocity, you are bound to have more or to have fairer relationship of exchange. While this is true, it's also true that it can put producer in a situation of self-exploitation, as God talks about, and as a result of the perceived responsibility for the consumers. So we see that producer many times put their well-being or try to go beyond just their own agreed duty to satisfy the consumer, and they do that because the relationship is not just one of a customer or producer relationship, but one of a friend or close or having a close relation. So that's one aspect that I wanted to discuss. Another consequence of the governing principles that we talked about refers to the consumer's engagement in the network. As we said previously, Peasant Box does a very well, it's a very good place for producers to be able to have more agency and have a voice in the exchange process. But at the same time, the same principles can have the effect of not giving enough space for consumers' engagement. So in this network in particular, consumers have a minimal role. And by this, I mean they do not participate in production, as it happens in other community-supported agriculture, where they would do, for example, voluntary work. They are not engaged in distribution. They receive the food at home. So they, how it happens in other community-supported agriculture, they would go and collect the boxes from a set place, and there would be a place of meeting and collaboration with other consumers and other producers. But in this particular CSA, it's not happening. So the relation remained very individualized between consumers and producers. And another aspect, they are not involved in any decision-making process, although they are named members. This title is more of a symbolic one, as they are not actually engaged in any decision-making process. And to compare with other CSA where there would be round tables where producer and consumer collaborate, this is not how it's done here, and that's also because in other such community-supported agriculture projects, consumers actually participate financially in the project at the beginning of the season, and this is not how it's done here. So the governing principle of this community-supported agriculture, as I said, does not offer space for engagement. The consumers do not see themselves as part of a political movement or as having their consumption more than just consumption, as being having a political meaning. And without a concept of self as a politically engaged, and without a conscious goal of a practice of resistance as part of a social movement, consumption remains just an act that reinforces the hegemonic discourse of neoliberalism, which stresses the importance of individual action over the on detriment of the collective action. I also wanted to point out that this is not necessary. So it is not necessarily true for all community-supported agriculture, and that is why it's very important to analyze the governing principles of each project, and to be mindful when constructing this kind of projects of these kind of consequences. And now I'm closing my presentation with the conclusions. So we have seen how alternative food networks managed to reintroduce these close relationships and to challenge our assumption of what these exchanges and how the relationship can look like in the food system, and also to propose an alternative practice that is mindful of these injustices in the food system. Yet, I also wanted to stress that not all alternative food networks are created equal, and by that I mean that being alternative or being local is not enough, and you have to be mindful of the premises and the governing principles on which you are basing these projects, and what is their actual transformative potential into creating a movement that is politically engaged. So I will stop here. Thank you very much to all the presenters. It was a very exciting conference, and to all the organizers, and thank you for listening. And that was my presentation.
Thank you very much, Hestia. So also for a discussion with Birgit. It should be very, very productive. We have some questions for you, for all of you. First of all, for Tasia. Tasia, I think already read them. So from Agota, she's asking that you could see these eco-villages, or what part of them as possible decolonial practices.
Yes, thank you, Agota, for the question. So I would like to start answering by saying that eco-villages in their norms and practices take a very contextualized, self-reflexive approach, which is very much grounded and adapted to the local, regional, national, international context. And in general, they see the world in a systemic view, meaning that they're also critical of the unequal power relation, including the post-colonial ones. So they do seek to deconstruct these ongoing power relations to a degree or another. In Artera it happens a lot, as they do take an anarcho-feminist ideological stance. And so, yes, I think they're inherently decolonial from that perspective. As I was mentioning during the presentation, they are inserted in the geography and cultural geography of Euskal Herria, which is a Basque country in the province of Navarra. The province of Navarra was conquered by the Spanish monarchy in the 18th century. So it hasn't been part of the, the history of this homogenizing Spanish identity. And also during the right-wing dictatorship of Franco, the Basque identity was very much suppressed through the suppression of language, direct repression and violence, and so on. And also politically, by not being able to represent themselves politically in the life of the community. So precisely because the people in the eco-village seek to bring to life again and to disseminate Basque language, for example, they do take this decolonial stance toward the colonizer or oppressor, which in this case is the Spanish state.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to say that perhaps is also the context for Catalonia, and also with the Catalan language, and what happened also with the Franco regime, and it applies also from this part of Spain. Also, Juana Senziana Marian is wondering if this kind of urban eco-village, you encounter urban eco-villages and or any communities that become eco-villages without transforming space, but just by redistributing resources.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Juana. I have no direct experience with urban eco-villages, as I was mostly focused on rural ones. But in the common ground of all these intentional communities, which call themselves or are labeled as eco-villages, are these self-governing practices grounded on the holistic norms of sustainability. Now, the issue with redistributing resources as a condition for emancipation, together with recognition and parity political participation, as Nancy Fraser would put it, is actually one of the hardest to enact in our today reality, and that is due to the hardship of taking ownership of modes of production within our capitalist market economy context. So this means that for such communities, it's very hard to produce income. So eco-villages are not necessarily economically autonomous within this global economic context, as it is particularly challenging to produce, to either produce income or to be able to live off a different type of economy, like an alternative economy to this capitalist market economy, for example, a moneyless economy, or to simply enact circular economy. This is very, very hard, as capitalism is obviously very much conditioning their economic practices and what can they actually, how much autonomy they can have from this perspective. Thank you.
Also, I wanted to add that in Catalonia, especially in Barcelona, it's happening like this kind of redistribution, but it's not actually an eco-village. Not there are more like flats or buildings that are given to the poor people or people that don't have money to pay their rent, and they are struggling with these financial magnates, and that they want to use this building for tourism, and they're fighting. Maybe perhaps can be a solution to this lack of buildings and shelters for people that don't have enough financial resources. So we continue with Birgit, a question for Birgit and Hestia. From Juana also. When the I'm sorry. Wondering if you see any coalition between food justice efforts and other economic justice efforts, housing, labor, that shapes seasonal migration patterns?
Okay, well, I can try to answer the question. I found it very interesting because I also was wondering right now who is participating actually in that kind of food policy councils, which I have presented, and where I can speak more of about the initiatives I came to know now in Germany, and they're mostly they're more like civil society initiatives behind them, and as I say, most of them are like middle white class, from a middle class white and academic background, and as far as I know, there are like no trade unions because they always try to connect different stakeholders, now from the whole value chain, from the producer, retailer to gastronomy. Some of them even have institutionalized that third part is civil society, third part public institution, third part from the economy. But there's like no really no trade union actor, I think, in that kind of initiatives. What I have observed is that there are where some try, as in the case in Berlin, for example, they really try to open to work with migrant organizations to make it more diverse in that sense, and to in that sense reach different social classes or backgrounds. And some are impulsed by like global solidarity networks or organizations that work with about development policy, like FIAN, and in that sense try to highlight the global connection. But in that sense, work with economic justice, I would say. And the housing issue, from my experience, I see there's in many cities there are connection between the alternative housing movement and the alternative food networks. That some initiatives of alternative food networks come out of this kind of community housing projects. I think like in Freiburg or in Tübingen, I could say that. But then we have to say it in many cases keeps in that kind of alternative spaces of circles, and the problem is to really reach the society in the city more as a whole. And also that was the idea, I think, with the food policy consensus, to really work, for example, about school catering, to really make a difference in that sense. And that also, I think, has a social or economic justice component to really try to make, it's difficult, schools catering a more sustainable or have their like regional organic criteria, and that is for children, for the whole society.
Hestia, do you want to add something else?
Yeah, I would like to add more generally that I think this movement for food justice also participates or connect with other economic justice efforts in the way that they help challenge the idea of commodifying basic human needs, like how it's food, but also housing. So in this way, they are adding on a post-capitalist imagination, and I think by creating these discourses and bringing them in the public eye, they interconnect with each other and help build a future in the direction of a post-capitalist future that sees the basic human needs as essential and not commodities. So that would be my comment.
All right. Manuela, Ovidio, do you want to ask something before continuing with the other questions? No?
Yeah, let Ovidio go first.
Okay. Shall I go first?
Yeah, go.
All right. No. First, thanks for this great panel, and I have two questions. One for Hestia and one for both Anastasia and Birgit. But first, let me tell you how important it is to see these presentations together, and the importance of Telciu too as a place where these questions can be raised together. It helps us reduce a little bit to size, capitalism, modernity, and all of that, right? And so my question is, comes, I guess, from a more surprising direction for Birgit and Anastasia is, well, you know, these practices of, you both touched on the issue of this being white middle class dominated projects. And so I keep on hearkening back to this idea that Amilcar Cabral has brought in the 50s, that the petty bourgeoisie, he has to commit class suicide in order for the conditions of a revolution, or in our case, a great transformation, to be made possible. So I was thinking, if you are looking in, or if you see this phenomenon of a bit of a, for lack of better words, class suicide of the white middle class becoming kind of like a basis for degrowth, wider degrowth movements, or you know, as a political project, right? And that, and if it takes also on another identification process, right? So not only the negative class exiting, but becoming something else. And that question both for Anastasia and for Birgit, and for Hestia, I was just wondering if the alternative food networks, if you know, Anastasia emphasized the systemic view taken by eco-villages, and I was wondering if the alternative food networks that you referred to in the context of your presentation also come with a systemic view of on the situation of ecological, the regional ecological biodiversity. And I'm talking this, looking at how you focused on this Cutiața Ranului, this example, the Peasant Box, but also referring to Western practices. And I'm wondering about the systemic view on ecology, because the ecological situation of Eastern Europe is different, or regions of Eastern Europe is different than that of regions of Western Europe, exiting out of modernity with less, let's say, with more biodiversity and less ecological disaster than England, for instance, or France. So those are the two questions. But thank you for a great panel.
So if I may start?
Yes, you can.
Thank you, Ovidiu, for your question. Yeah, it's quite a conundrum how these transformations at the level of individual social positioning and then connect to class through these practices. As I also said in my presentation, once someone becomes a part of an eco-village, such seen as an alternative political community, it definitely becomes something else. So for some people, even white middle class ones, it's sort of a, let's say, personal awakening, and finding I don't know, a more authentic and sustainable way of life beyond, you know, consumerism and this superficial luxury, which actually has very negative impacts in terms of social atomization and lack of enriching interpersonal relations. So yes, some of them put themselves into this seemingly precarious situation in order to win on this other side. But the thing is, with in a way, I see your question very much connected to what Juana asked before, the fact that eco-villages within this capitalist market economy context are very hardly becoming autonomous economically. That means that there are very few resources to redistribute within the community, which means that practically, at least in Artera, for example, each person needs to have their own, let's say, project that would become a source of income for that individual person. And so, of course, if these communities would have more resources to redistribute, they would be able to accommodate and to integrate people with less opportunities economically, or who are marginalized economically. I do know, for example, of occupied villages which act as, according to eco-village practices, next to Artera, so still in Basque Country, which do take in refugees, for example. So they are able to support them financially for a while until they can either have their own project or contribute to the local common production scheme. But it's rather, again, it's rather complicated to work within the normative capitalist setting. And if you'd like an anecdotal example from former Eastern Germany, at last year's Global Eco-Village Europe meeting, I met this one of the founders of a new eco-village which had bought like an old hunting village from the local administration in Germany, and they were bound by contract to not say the exact sum that they had acquired the land and housing with for, but the sum was in the order of millions of euros. So probably 2 or 3 million euros, which is obviously, it's not for everyone. I mean, my face dropped when I heard that price, and he was like, but it's not really that much for someone making money in Germany. And of course, the cost of establishing an eco-village varies a lot from regarding the region or the country you are in or from, or trying to establish it. For example, many eco-villages in Spain or Portugal were established by people from Germany, France, UK, because it was easier for them with the means that they had accumulated during their, let's say, common productive life to have the economic means to establish a new community. So I think it's very much tied, the inclusion of people from different economic backgrounds is very much tied with how much economic autonomy can these communities have. That would be all from me.
Okay, so I also try to answer the question, very tricky, but very interesting. If I understood it right, the question is to raise up a degrowth movement. Can we do this with the middle class right sector, or have they to commit class suicide? So the question about with which identity, or do we need a new identification for that kind of engagement? But I will refer again to the local food policy concept. But I myself was questioning this. I think it's a continuing challenging, and also for me participating in that space, it's like, am I the next white middle class person participating in that? No, also with a doctor title was. But then my reflection was also to also maybe an opportunity to maybe use the privileges we have in this kind of positions to try to make a difference and to influence local policies, but still there is the challenge to make the space open also for other voices and visions, and to reflect all the time of with who do we work, which persons are like in the nuclear, in the core group, which one are in the groups are in the wider network, and how can we make this more integrative. I think it's a continuing challenge, and for me the answer was, well, I can use my privileges I have to open up the spaces, because sometimes it's also a chance to make issues more public, like we have now in Tübingen, the issue about the local government wants to close a slaughterhouse where local producer bring their animals, and it's an important part for the local, producers to can bring their animals there for the meat production on a local scale. So in that case, it's sometimes opportunity to make such issues more public and to, in that sense, use privileges. Offer the challenge continues to be more integrative. And on the other hand, in terms of identity, I think it's important to pass from that kind of consumer identity to a citizen identity. There's also the concept of food democracy and food citizenship. I've forgotten the author, but which is discussed in the regarding to this topic. And I think that's also a crucial point, that we really not only here consumers to buy only food and leave it all to the market, but also really to identify ourselves as citizens, and we can decide about local food policy. Yeah, and here also the challenge is to make that food citizenship open to really all people and that local context.
Okay, now to address your question, which I'm not really sure I'm remember correctly, but so you ask about if the project has the idea of loss of biodiversity in sight, and what I gather from my field work is that they are in a way yes, addressing and stressing this point that you need to have, as I said, good relationship with the earth, but at the same time are very critical of the expenditure of organic certification that we have seen have emerged as a result of these concerns regarding loss of biodiversity and the impact that it has on land. But these organic certification were very easily co-opted by corporations without actually changing the underlying productivist logic. So they just created niches to be exploited by corporations without having any fixes for the larger structures into the food system. So that's why I think their practice of not imposing a certain standard and not monitoring offer an alternative to producers who would not be able to access these organic certifications because they are expensive and hard to obtain. But also they created the space to discuss and form these ideas of how we can make agriculture that is not intensive and that has the idea of caring for the earth or reality. I don't know if I addressed your question exactly, but
it was also if they have, yes, it did parts of it, but also if they have a systemic view, if they take a systemic view and look at all the other sectors that they touch on while creating this alternative distribution and production.
Okay, so from what I gathered in my fieldwork, I think they do address certain systemic problems regarding the peasant position in Romania and the marginality that they have, but I wouldn't say they are having that much of a systemic view. But they are more focused on the position of the peasant, I think.
Manuela?
Yes, thank you so much. To all the panel, I think it's really great to group those papers together, and they speak a lot to each other, like Ovidiu said already. I also have a question and or comment for each of you. really just to learn more rather than to challenge anyone, because this is not at all my field, but I think it relates to so many things. For Tasya, I was thinking when you were talking about how these eco-villages are resisting the nation-state framework. I was thinking about some of the discussions we've had about how the nation state and resistance to the nation state is itself a bit of a trap, because it's anti-colonial but doesn't end up being decolonial. And you've mentioned how this was not even part of the nation state building that Spain claims today. Adina pointed out to how Catalonia is not the same, and we haven't even touched on the Canaries, right? So we could turn around the whole thing and say, is Spain even a nation state? Or what is it that they're resisting? Because, I mean, it still has occupied territories, if we don't want to call them colonies. And some people would argue for some colonial status. So I'm just, maybe it's a detail, but I think resistance to state structure or state power is not the same as resistance to the nation state. And I was wondering whether there's anything in the discourse or the self-identification of the eco-villages that you know that reflects this ambiguity, or do they take the nation state as a nation for granted and they react to that? Because I think that would make the reaction very much anti-state or anti-colonial rather than decolonial. And that's a very internal conversation for us to have, but maybe it drives home a more theoretical point. Yes, Birgit, we have been in conversation for some time, and I really love the way your project is going. And I'm more and more convinced that coloniality of food is not just a subset of the coloniality of power. Because in the beginning, I was like, well, I mean, isn't that what Quijano is saying? Coloniality of power. It's like, it's not over, it's all over, like Mignolo says. So of course it's in food as well, right? But I think you drive home a really important point about how it's not just a racial hierarchy, and it's not just economic dependence. It's really what you can have access to and what gets kind of taken out of your food plan completely. So yeah, I was just curious on how you would relate that conceptually, because I'm all about concepts and theories. So whether you would say coloniality of food is kind of a still a sub level, like a level down from the overarching coloniality of power without being subsumed to it, because I don't see it as subsumed, but it's still not its own colonial matrix, or is it? I don't know if that makes sense, because it seemed the kind of maps that you showed was like, it should all be coloniality of food because it started out with food. It's like the kind of the introduction that Ovidio gives to the decolonial summer school, right? The maize and the where does mamaliga come from, and would we have mamaliga, and what is the national dish in relation to colonial power? So yeah, as you see, it was very inspiring. So maybe you have some ideas on that. And to Hestia, thank you so much. Also, that was a lot of it was new to me, and I'm still kind of working through it, so it's not a well thought out reaction to it. But also in terms of talking about alternative food networks as what you call them, a virtual space of resistance, and you were very cautious to say, well, not all of them are. How would you relate resistance to decoloniality? Because resistance, again, and this relates a bit to the question that I asked Tasya, it's an anti-power, anti-state, anti-colonial. Is it decolonial? Or even the ones that you consider progressive are within a state framework and are not? I mean, not to belittle them at all. Resistance is very respectful, but is it decolonial, or is it staying within the frame of state discourse? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuela, for your comments and questions. I was actually looking forward for you to seeing my presentation, as I know you work on this topic extensively. As I was also saying within my presentation, I do think that eco-villages generally take a very pragmatic approach to what is possible in terms of practices, and also what possibilities for resistance and deconstruction there are. So while at the same time they do constitute themselves as alternative political communities in opposition to the state, in the sense that they claim this ownership of their own self-determination and their political practices, they do seek, as I was saying, every and all possible opportunities to disseminate their knowledge and practices, and to also engage with the normative institutional state systems. So from that point of view, they work within the norm of the nation state, but also very much against it. And another level to which I think they aim to go against the state and also take a decolonial stance is their alliances they're forming, which go over and beyond Europe, for example, to communities in former colonies, but also it's very important for me in my research that this comes from a positioning of international citizenship. So that is the systemic view of the world allows them to enact, even if in a very small contained spaces, this kind of international citizenship practice is grounded on sustainability, but at the same time, they actively engage in alliances and networks that go beyond their nation state territory, let's say. So I think they're working on all these and all these levels. And also what I found in a more, let's say, beyond this very rational and pragmatic approach to what micropolitical self-governing practices can be, is that they do cultivate a contextual deconstruction of the power relationship they're in. So they're very self-reflexive in that, and they try to be as aware as possible when they enact or embody any type of unequal power, or when they're in this kind of relationship. So they're very trained in this to different degrees, according also to their specific ideologies. Not all of them are anarcho-feminists, some are communists, some are a bit more spiritual, and so this also kind of defines the power relations that they are more sensitive to. But yeah, I would say that they also have this kind of experiential and knowledge through sensibility experiences that allow them to not just, you know, deconstruct from a theoretical stance or point of view these relationships, but also to recognize how they experience them and how they can be stopped from reproducing them. So how they can stop themselves from reproducing them in that sense. And I think this would count as a decolonial approach. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Manuela, for the question and for your comment. I really find it worth to think more about it, but I have to say that when I started my field research about urban agriculture in Colombia, like 5 years ago, I was more like wanting to learn more about the initiatives there. And then I discovered that it's really politically what they are planting there and what kind of types of vegetables are in the gardens. Is it kind of practice of discovering native plants again or not. And so it was the coloniality of food was for me like a issue that came up like already in finishing the writing to give it to look again on it from a more decolonial point of view, and it was like, wow, that could be another analysis on, on my work, and I really want to continue also working more on that. And when I made the presentation, I was first thinking about that three concepts of coloniality of power, coloniality of being, and of knowledge. And for me, it was clear that coloniality of food has to do with political economy, but also with that knowledge dimension, but because it's not only about rediscovering native types, but also the knowledge about it, and also the how is it valued. Yeah, there would be much more analysis about it. Also, not only racial, also gender dimension. For example, the meat consumption. It was more my observation in Colombia that it's related on the one hand to a masculinized discourse of eating meat makes you strong, and also like to wanting to become part of middle class. It is when you can eat all day meat, you're like in a better off. So there are a lot of class issues and racial and gendered issues dimension behind what kind of food do we eat. So I think it would be worth to really go more deeper into analyzing it and with more case studies. And it's a good question if it's worth to be our own concept, coloniality of food. In the decolonial debate, I would say yes, but we should investigate more about it and from more different contexts and perspectives.
Actually, if I may add just very quickly, because exactly what you're saying about meat makes you strong, and if you can eat meat every day, is not only a class issue, but also in terms of imperial differences, is something that you would very much encounter in state socialist spaces, right? Because scarcity of meat was one way to create or to even tell that there was inequality, because the discourse was all about equality, but you could tell who had access to meat by the very different networks. It was a class issue, but it was an issue of who had relatives in the village who could provide some meat also. So just shutting up. Thank you.
Hey, Manuela, thank you for your question. It's very interesting, and I'm not really sure I can do it justice. So the way I see it, it's important to stress that alternative food networks vary greatly, and we need to discuss on what's alternative, because it's not it shouldn't be placed into alternative versus conventional, and it's more practices that fall between these two extremes. So that's one important aspect. So I think they could be they could relate or to have this decolonial stance, but not all of them, as some are very close to what conventional food network would look like. But yeah, I'm not really sure I have enough information to further your question, but it's a very interesting point to further inquiry. So thank you.
No, thank you. And also briefly, sorry, the terminology is telling in itself, right? Like the way you rightly pointed out, alternative is alternative to the norm. So it is already outside of the accepted. So that makes it alternative, but looking at variety within the alternative would really make the difference, pun intended. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Manuela. Hestia, just one more question. Maria Martelli is asking you that if you could touch upon what determines these governing principles and how these CSA do better in terms of justice.
Okay, thank you, Maria, for your question. I think what determines its governing principles is what I said regarding how this community-supported agriculture was built, and it was built with producers for them, and it had this issue of the position of marginality of peasants inside. So building on this, that was the main point, to create these spaces that offer more agency to producers, and this is why consumers are not so engaged and don't have, like I said, a space to be involved. There are other such projects that are created by consumers and stresses more the role of consumer, where they could take part of the production role. But yeah, I think this the premise of this alternative food network was building something for the small producers. And how could this CSA do better in terms of justice? Again, I think it's important, as I said, to stress that when building these movements, it's important to look at what the political effects are, and how you can make a movement that is engaged and can have political engagement from others, and can not just challenge some assumptions, but also propose some changes. So yeah, thank you, Maria.
Thank you, all of you, for these wonderful presentations. And I hope that you are not very tired. So we will be back around 6 o'clock with our keynote speaker, Julie Klinger from University of Delaware. So be prepared and ask questions as usual. And thank you very much.